Welcome back to another SCX24 tuning session. And today we're going to be looking at the Nightcrawler build here that you see. And we're going to be focusing on servos, front and rear, and adding a BEC at 8.4 volts. So if you had seen the Road 6040 tuning session with this Nightcrawler, I guess that was the last update. Did quite a bit of front bias weight and shock tuning to give it just some extreme flex, but also keeping it limited and sitting low. And after that was complete, turned it on, gave it a little test, and noticed with that added weight up front just how weak the Emax servo was. So this is running a Lizard, just an original Lizard right now with a PRE-BEC inline BEC, and I believe that's a 5.5 volt BEC, maybe just a 5 volt, but it's pumping it up from the original Lizard, which was a pretty low BEC. So anyways, we've got pretty high-end servo right here and some pretty low-end packaging. I believe this is at 8.4 volts, 104 ounce inches. And then we've got a very beautiful servo and some very nice packaging with some very nice etching. And I believe this is in the range of maybe 40 grams versus kind of the typical aluminum cased big ones are maybe 20, 22. But we'll take a quick look at the specs here. So this guy at 8.4 volts is 158 ounce inches, which is insane. So that's just crazy. This thing has massive specs. Look, even at 4.8 volts, no BEC, 100 ounce inches, so just insanity. So anyways, this is going to go up front, adding some weight to the front, again, hoping to get a little closer to that 6040 bias. And then we've got an OGRC rip-off of Mofo's best servo mount ever. So this is a red aluminum anodized tray. Mofo is sold out of his aluminum best servo mount ever right now, so hence the knockoff here on the table. So anyways, we are going to jump in and I guess before we do anything, let's throw a battery in here, take a look at the weight, where it sits, and also let's take a look at these servos, just how these are responding now versus what we're going to put in there. Okay, quick baseline weigh-in. So you can see this is a pretty heavy build, sitting at 739 grams with the 57% front bias. So that is pretty good right there. Maybe we will tip that a little further with that brass servo, but we shall see. So 26 ounces. So always good to know a baseline, and of course this is with the battery in there. So let's get these scales off and out of the way. All right, take a look at these guys. Look at that. Oh, it's struggling. Once you get them rolling, look at that. So that front end is, look at that, will not turn back. Start moving and it will. So yeah, we really need an upgrade for that front servo. The back servo doesn't have near as much weight, so it's still performing, but because we're going to put this up at 8.4 volts, it's going to force me to upgrade that rear servo. So that's why I've got an OGRC. A little less cost, but still a great servo and can handle the 8.4 volts that we want to run to that brass servo beast up front. So anyways, I think now we're going to maybe start digging into this guy and actually see what we need to do here. All right, let's take a look under the hood here. So the way I've got this set up, the passenger side that we're looking at here has all of the ESC receiver and servo BEC connection. So I think we're basically going to have to totally pull everything off of this side, and that'll allow us to remove the servos and redo all this wiring. You can see here's the motor wire here coming to the BEC. So this is the Lizard because it's got the old plug extension. You can't plug it directly to the board. You can see there is the BEC right there, and there's the Bluetooth module hidden in there. I think this is all just servo slack, so potentially I may just cut that wire down on that OGRC, get rid of some of that, and then you can see this opposite side is all just switching and lights. So on this side, all I need to do is unplug the lights. So what I always do on complex ones like this is take a photo, and then I can see exactly, you know, how I had it routed, and in this case I've got a video, so even better. But it's always good to do, so you can plug it all back up really quickly, easily, especially when it's kind of twisted in and under and around things. It's good to know. So anyways, let's get this body shell off and we can start into the surgery. Okay, made a little progress here, and I've partially gutted this passenger side. So you can see I basically unplugged everything from the receiver and then just pulled that guy right on out of there. And the side of it there, the double side, is where that existing FURITEC BEC was. You see there, and then you can see the size here to this NSDRC. But pretty clean, cleaner than I remember. Coiled up rear servo, coiled up front servo slack, switch going under the battery tray, and then that's the plug for the ESC. And then the motor plug is actually double-sided down, nice and coiled, and then the BEC is double-sided. So pretty clean. I may have to pull that ESC out eventually, but we'll see. So quick look here at this OGRC. So it does not come with an aluminum horn, and I forgot to get an NSDRC, so I'll probably have to cut down this plastic one to put on there. So one nice feature of this little more expensive brass servo beast, besides the specs and besides the brass weight, is that it comes with the aluminum servo horn for the SCX24s. So also comes with some little SCX24 hardware and micro nuts and the plastic horn. So a lot of options there with the Mofo servo beast. So it was a little more expensive, but that's usually 10 bucks more you have to add on to these expensive servos, and that's included. So that's great. So I think now we're gonna probably dive into that rear servo, so we get that installed, since I think that'll be easy. This front one may be a little issue. It's about the same size as the back one, but much larger than the Emax that's in there. And you can see I've already cut the bumper mount. I've already scooted it back on a best servo mount ever that's installed. But I've got this ESC tray with my limiting rubber band coming up there. So hopefully there's not a lot of clearance issues. One thing I forgot to mention on this servo beast is another feature built in is the pre-rounded servo mounts. So usually that's something on these that you have to kind of round off yourself with a Dremel, cut down, because they catch on the frame. So that's nice. That's already kind of taken into consideration. So anyways, let's jump into this guy. Quick weight check here on these servos and servo trays. So it looks like we're going to end up gaining 10 grams with this install of the OGRC servo and aluminum servo mount. So hopefully we'll have enough added weight up here with the brass servo to offset that. But I think with those knuckles and steering links there, I think this red tray is going to be another nice little accent to the rear axle. So I think next step, we'll get that installed and then go from there. But what happened here? Got the whole rear axle pulled out of there. I'll tell you what happened. This knockoff Mofo best servo mount ever from OGRC did not fit the metal housing here. So if I'm remembering right, and just from the looks of this metal housing, this looks like a early knockoff metal housing, because it doesn't have hot racing on the diff cover, and the finish looks you know, like those early knockoff axles. So I don't know who is at fault here, the servo mount or the metal assembly, but it may be a blessing in disguise. So it looks like it fits up perfectly to the stock housing. I've used one of these before of this brand, and it fit up to the axle, and I can't remember if it was plastic or metal, but the plastic, you know, definitely has a little give, but it didn't feel like any binding or anything going on this one. This one, the top screws would bind, and one was kicked you couldn't get it in, and since it's all metal, there's no play. So you're gonna break something or strip something. So I'm gonna swap all the components over, save this for something else, and we will actually probably lose a little weight off of the rear, which is good since we're adding it with that servo. We were adding a little bit more, like 10 grams, so maybe this will help even out after all. But you know, always something with these builds, always some little hang up. This time it was the servo. We'll see how smoothly the front end goes, but for now I think I've got it solved. Make this swap and move on. Okay, so you can see you got this rear axle, this front rear axle back installed. Tested it, everything is going smooth. Centered up the servo, got that connected. So as you can see, I've got the servo cord kind of training itself with this rubber band around here, holding it tight, because that was hitting this, I guess this frame, this back frame mount for the shock mount. So I realized I've got these aluminum hot racing kind of shock mount body post mounts on here for no reason. They do connect the fenders up here, so I think I'm going to swap these out for plastic and cut that off, and then that should alleviate that from catching. And then you can see I don't have any of the frame trimmed here. I think it's just the way this servo's hitting. I may have to. I didn't on the other one. It's hard to tell because that cord is hitting before it can really slide up. This side is pretty good, and you can see I did trim these servo mounts down. The prior ones were as well. So you can see I did clearance the frame for that other Emax mount, but these are much deeper. So I think I need to take that clearance kind of back and take out more of that C channel. And then this mount is not in the way, this rear mount of the frame, because there is no cord. So it's really just getting clearance for this red mount to kind of slide past the frame there. So you can see it's knocking right there, but then you can see the front is already cut out. So anyways, there's going to be a little clearancing there on the frame, and I think that will wrap up the rear and have that fully functioning and compressing without getting anything in the way here, without any collisions. So a little more to do there, but moving right along. Okay, after quite a bit of frame clearancing, I've got my full compression, I've got my full twist here, and I had to do a little bit of trimming on the bumper mounts. So you can see there where I cut off that rear leg, so that's just kind of triangulated there coming up. So that gives clearance for that servo to get in there. You can see the back of that is right up in there in that cord. And then I had to clearance the top of the frame, the channel, and the bottom, because this servo gets so far up in there. And then I took off the two ribs, the piece of plastic there, the back of the battery tray. And you can see there, it just clears the hardware there, both sides, and then the battery tray as well. It's just getting super tight. So you can see there where I had to cut those ribs off. I moved my limit strap mount down here to the battery tray. It was going through the back side. And then you can see I took out a chunk of the bumper mount there, so this guy can get up there. So all in all, working out really, really well. Plugged it up, centered it, and of course don't have the BEC in there yet, but seems to be working just fine. So I think we are on to the front, and hopefully we're not going to have as much of a fitment issue, but we probably will. So let's see about this brass servo beast. Back with a little front end progress. As you can see, I went ahead and pulled this whole front axle assembly just to make this whole process a little bit easier. And as I said, I already had a brass best servo mount ever installed prior on the front, so that's going back on. So I wanted to go ahead and get this Emax and the brass servo beast up here to size them up together. And this Emax on the right is coming in a bit heavy at 19 grams, but I've got an automotive tire weight stuck to the top of it, so like a 1/4 ounce weight there. So a little bit heavier than that one that was on the rear, but it doesn't really matter when you put it up next to that brass servo beast. That's almost 44 grams. So just a massive like doubling there on the front weight. So hopefully that's definitely going to push us another % forward. But just wanted to size these up next to each other and know what we're working with before we get any further. All right, got this servo and mount kind of mocked up on the front axle here, and man, it's nice and weighty. And looking at this, what's jumping out at me with all the brass highlights and black is the aluminum and black. And I realized I had an aluminum steering link, so I dug around in my parts and I've got a brand new spare black brass Treal steering link. So I'm going to swap this in, be a little more weight on the front. And I think while I've got these links off, I'm going to go ahead and clearance these knuckles. There's a little cutout for the kind of the shock head hardware, and you can see a little raw brass. So it's just not enough for these aftermarket shocks. So I'm going to go ahead and clearance out this little pocket on the knuckles just a bit more on both sides, just to make sure I'm not crushing anything. And of course I'll have to really adjust this servo endpoints and dual rates so I make sure not to snap anything. But since I've got all the steering off to do those two things, then I think it would be an opportune time to go ahead and put overdrive in if I was ever going to. So I dug around and I had a 30% Mofo overdrive. So I'm going to go ahead and throw that in there. So a couple of unplanned surprise tuning options here, but I think those will benefit the build overall. So I think we're going to go ahead and jump in, dig into that axle, see if I can't get that done, and then I'll be back. Okay, overdrive is in and we are reassembled with brass links, and man, it feels nice and weighty. I did have to use 3 O-rings on this worm gear. I used 2 in the front, 1 in the rear, and I've still got just a little bit of play in and out, but everything is just buttery smooth, super nice. So let's take a look here at the added clearance to this this hardware here. Let's see if we can see this, so you can kind of see the table. So there you go. So that head is fully clear and we are at the extreme that this can turn. So that is the case on both sides, so that's what you want. So just have to get the servo adjusted and then everything should be kosher with this. So next thing is seeing about fitting this into the chassis and seeing if there's any clearance issues. Well, this looks good, right? Almost. We're good on clearances. Of course, we don't have a lot of travel with these 32 millimeters, but if you look straight down, you can see how close it is and how far out that horn is. So there's no way to get this bumper back on. So that servo is going to have to scoot back because I've got this just on the bumper bracket. I removed the typical kind of forward drop down brackets that go to this piece, so I could tuck it up and bring it back. So with that bumper there, there's nowhere to go but back with that servo. So that's probably going to move that limit strap from up and over to maybe under and back to this point. And I may have to actually take out some of this edge of the tray depending on how far that servo gets scooted back. But looks like maybe some frame rail clearance, maybe not. I've already clearanced out a little bit for that Emax that was in there. So anyways, it looks like there's going to be a little more fitment with this servo to get it in its home before we're done and can get over here to wiring in that BEC. So a little bit of progress, but you know, as always, it takes a little time. looks like success. I've got this servo scooted back and shoehorned in, and look at that. Nice clearance side to side. Didn't have to modify the tray at all. I could probably still run the limiters right up the back where they were, but I went ahead and flipped them under the tray. And I had that notch already on the frame on that lower C channel there, so I just kind of extended that a little more for that servo mount. And then this side I didn't need it at all. It just, the shape of those, they just roll right off. I mean, I'm loving the design of that. I think they would have rolled right off of this one had it not already been cut and a little jagged, so I just smoothed it out, but super happy with that. So I've got my full, you know, short shock articulation up front, very smooth. And the only thing I had to do was cut a little nub, I guess, off of this side at the bottom of the post here, and that was for the cable. You can see the cable in there. That was actually hitting it, so that allows that to get all the way down without hitting anything. Of course, this side didn't have to trim it. You can see it there, but there's no cable on that side. So the other thing was the bumper. I just clipped this mount off a little bit more of it. I think it was extended on this side, so I clipped it flush just like this side. And I'll pop that on here real quick and show you, but it just barely squeaks by. Well, I test fit the bumper and I was barely just rubbing, so I pulled it apart and got the Dremel after these posts just to take them down a little bit more, and clip these basically into C's, so about as tight as they can be and still mount. But get this reassembled and see if that's going to work. All right, I've got that bumper mounted, and you can see how close those posts are to the servo. So shaving those down with the Dremel, got them flush with the back edge of the plastic, and then you can see the servo horn there just comes up right beside that mount point. So just super tight right there. The little gear piece on the servo case can just barely catch the edge of that plastic at the bottom of that mount, but it doesn't affect anything. You know, there's so much weight on this axle, and that's nice and smooth. So the one thing I did notice, and if you'll notice closely at the compression of the shock, so right down the middle, I can't get all the way down. So with the bumper on, it pinched the frame, or it, you know, kept it straight. So that is actually pinching the rounded servo mounts. So, you know, most people probably wouldn't care. I can still get full side to side. I'm just stopped from full droop right down the middle by probably 2 millimeters, 3 millimeters, somewhere in there. So I think the solution, at least for me, is to pull this back out and just clearance those kind of C-channel frame rails right there for the servo mounts, and that should do it. And hopefully that'll put the front end to bed and we can move on to this mess right here. I think we have a winner. So that little bit of frame trim seemed to do the trick. So you can see right there on the edge, just taking out kind of that upper and lower C channel. Allows those servo mounts to get all the way up. You can see there's space. Nothing is touching, so super happy. Everything is working out, but man, talk about shoehorning in. That is a large servo, especially with that bumper high and tucked back like that. That's insane. So I think we are done with all the fitment. I still need to do the setup on the front servo as far as dual rates and endpoints. But other than that, I'm gonna get the wheels on there and we can move on and maybe look at this BEC, get that in, and we'll be done. Let's take a quick look here now that I've got the endpoints adjusted on this thing, and you can really just see how valuable that little Dremel work was on those knuckles. I can basically get under the mount, under that piece of hardware, and I'm not anywhere bucking or binding. I mean, it's just super smooth. So you can just get so much more throw out of these big bulky knuckles if you do that little bit of clearance in there. I mean, it's just, that's just amazing. So it's kind of a fail. I mean, maybe my guess is they clearance with the OEM shocks, but I mean, Treal makes aftermarket shocks. These are Treal shocks. You think they would clearance enough for their own, you know, aftermarket products, but you know, it gives you something to do, gives you a reason to own a Dremel. But what I'm curious about is that 8.4 volt speed. So this is just plugged into the Lizard. So I think this is 5 volt BEC built in at 1.5 amp. So that's the speed, and that's not slow. But man, it's going to be so much faster. So let me get these wheels on, and then we'll take a look at getting that BEC in. Well, we probably don't even need a BEC in this. Look at this. This is insane. So it's got such good turning, I had to actually back off the front and the rear a little bit. So the front is good in the forward direction, but I think because of the front overdrive and reverse, it's pushing, so you can hear it catch the sliders. But for now, I think I'm going to leave it until I get the body on there. But man, no problem turning those wheels. And with this 30% overdrive, man, it can turn tight. Look at that, just pulling it. Alright, so enough playing around. Time to get this BEC installed. So you can see I've kind of got it laid out here schematically how I want it. And we'll just talk through it here. So in this scenario, you've got your BEC powered by the balance plug of the battery. That's going to power the receiver. So the receiver's powered. Your ESC is not, so that's plugged in normally to the battery to power that ESC. And the connection from your ESC to your receiver to send signal no longer needs to power this receiver. So you just remove this center cable there from that plug. So we'll get this plug back in, and now we've isolated the receiver power from the ESC power, and that should be good to go. One other thing I wanted to note was I was hunting around for a small 3S to fit in here, and I remembered the Lizard is so old, it is not 3S capable. And I don't think I have a 3S that's small enough to fit in here with that interior tray anyway, so it may be a moot point, but we're still going to get 8.4 out of the gate through this, since this is a 2S, so that's 4.2 per cell, so fully charged, it's 8.4 volts, and then it will drop after that, but that's typical. You typically want to put in a little bit higher voltage than your output because of that drop, because you're not going to get a 7.4 and 8.4 constant. You get that as long as the battery has that or above, but once the battery drops below that, you know, everything drops. This cannot produce more than what comes in. It can step it down, but it can't step it up. So just something to know there. But all in all, this should be, you know, in theory, this is super simple. The hard part is going to be fitting it all back in there, since this is quite a bit larger, but I think I've got a game plan. I think it may be pretty similar to how it was, but anyways, I'm going to jump into it. All right, Humpty Dumpty is back together again for the most part. I'd say 90%, at least for the part that I was working on. So you can kind of see here, this went together pretty much like it was, very similar. Kept it low, nothing higher kind of than the motor battery, kind of that fender level there. Keep it nice and tucked. But I had much less slack for that rear servo, so not a lot there in the way. The front servo has a much shorter cord, so just worked out perfect, so no significant slack to coil. This is the switch from under the battery tray, and then the 2 wires from the ESC, the black and white, are coming up here, and then this is the BEC with kind of the short power cable coming down. That's double-sided here where the Bluetooth was, and then the long kind of cable that comes back to the balance port is snaked under the receiver, kind of with the motor cable and the Lizard that's under there. And then the only thing I really had to shift here was that Bluetooth and that's just kind of tucked in here to the side, and it seems to work out pretty well. So I've got a fresh battery charged up here, so we should have 8.4 volts to start with. So I'm going to get this in, I'll show you how that battery situates and plugs in, and then we'll give it a quick test. Then the challenge will be getting the shell on. Okay, battery's in, and man, it's nice and low pro. Look at that. So the balance cord just kind of snakes right there by the fender, gets right in there. So that plug has to be back here pretty close because that balance cable is really short on these batteries. And then the battery, you can see, is kind of all the way forward in the tray, and just the plug is just down here. So hopefully there'll be enough room to get all the wiring for the lights back through here and over the top. I did have the bumper lights routed underneath the battery, but now because of this servo and the new suspension, there is no room to route any wiring through there under the tray. So there's going to be 2 more sets of wires coming through kind of that little crevice there, but hopefully that will all work. But anyways, let's do what we came here for. Let's take a look at these servos. So you remember before how slow they were. Look at that, just dancing. Wow, much improved. And the strength as well. Not that there's really a way to show you the strength. I'm not one of those people that wants to hold the wheel and wiggle the truck. I don't think that's very good for the knuckle or the inner axles, but you'll just have to trust me when I tell you these things are strong. They're definitely fast, and you can see that. So now that we've tested that, I think we're ready for kind of the final completion, get the shell back on there, get everything plugged up, and give it a final test, make sure the actual body can close, and we'll be done with this tuning session. Well, got all the lights plugged back in, got a battery in there, and the shell closed. So I have not turned it on to test it, but I figured it'd be a great time to get it on the scales, see where we ended up with the final weight here on the build, see how close we came to 60/40. There we go. Look at that. You can't get any closer to 60/40 without hitting 60/40 than that. So 5941 with a, let's say that's a 762 gram weight. So pretty hefty. Let's flip over to ounces. So almost 27 ounces. So man, just incredibly heavy. But the combination of dropping the metal axle off the rear, adding the brass servo, and then a little bit of help from the brass steering links brought it up quite a bit here. So I think now that we know the weight, I think we'll get it off of here, and I'll get the battery plugged in, and we'll actually give it a little test, make sure all those lights are actually working, and I think we'll be about wrapped up here. We are plugged up and ready for testing. You can see we are creeping along here. So let's see if these lights are going to work for me. So headlights, tail lights, that works. So these should now go off, and the light bar and bumpers come on. And the tail lights stay on, and the headlights go to halo. So everything is red. Then this next switch is going to bring the headlights back on. Boom. Everything works. Here's a shot of that rear. So this rear has the diodes wired into the rear tail lights. So the tail lights are plugged into both switches, so they want to stay on all the time. So headlights, tail lights, then tail lights are going to stay on now. Everything else is going to, the front headlights will switch off. Everything else switches on, and the headlights are back on. Sweet. So I'm going to have to adjust that steering back a little more. You can hear me getting into the sliders. But on the bright side, everything works. Too much steering is not a bad thing. So I'll just dial that back a little, get that rubber out of the slider there from catching. But overall, I gotta say, I am super happy with this guy. Super happy with the upgrades. Glad it all works again. And I think the power of those servos is just gonna be a great upgrade. I mean, you saw how weak it was before, trying to move all this weight. And speaking of weight, getting that little extra bit from the brass servo beast is just awesome. So this thing is right there at the precipice of 60/40. So this is just hopefully going to be one of my best performing Jeeps. So I got to get it out and give it a little run. But I think for now we're done with it, and I'm happy with it. So as always, I hope you learned something on the build journey. I definitely did. And until next time, thanks for watching.